Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'm Major Garrett, Chief White House Correspondent for CBS News, but most importantly, I'm Luke Garrett's father. And I'm also Mary Ellen Garrett's father and Audrey Garrett's father. All three of my children are here, so a round of applause for my three kids, okay? That is the most important work I'll ever do in my life, and whatever accomplishments I do professionally will pale next to the comparison of being their father, which is the greatest honor of my life. I know I'm the last thing standing between many of you and the freeway, margaritas, fish tacos, or anything else associated with celebrating Thanksgiving, so I will try to be brief, but I will take lots of questions, or as many as you have, after my remarks. The other thing I appreciate is the size of the crowd here. I'm kind of overwhelmed by it. For those of you who are here voluntarily, I am deeply thankful. For those of you who are here on a compulsory basis, I will try to make it worth your while. As Brian indicated, I'm going to talk about one aspect of my job, which is covering the Trump presidency and its relationship to the First Amendment and the conversation the president initiated during the campaign and then given even greater voice to as the 45th President of the United States about fake news. That's one aspect of the Trump experience. It is only one aspect of the Trump experience. Trust me, I appreciate that. I know that. You may have questions about other aspects of the Trump presidency, and I will do my level best after my remarks to answer those questions. Before I start, let me just get those of you to raise your hands. How many of you, let's say in the last 6 months, watched the CBS Evening News or CBS This Morning on television? Raise your hand. Oh, excellent. That's good. How many of you watched it on your computer, your laptop? Okay, excellent. How many of you are familiar with CBSN, our digital platform, which is not on television, only available on the digital format? Raise your hand if you're familiar with it. Great. Excellent. That helps me out. Just because our industry is changing so much, the means by which we communicate our news and reach the audience is changing in myriad ways, and that television audience is reassuring to me, but I also know that the digital audience is an enormous part of our future. I've tried to adapt to it as best I can. The podcast I created is part of that long-form journalism to create a different conversation outside of the contours and the confines of broadcast journalism. It's a somewhat compressed environment, 1.5, 2 minutes maybe 2.5 if it's a really luxurious story and we can really let it breathe. So it's good, it's reassuring to know that those of you who consume CBS News, either in the morning or in the evening, still do so in large measure over the television, but also are aware of it on all the various digital platforms. All right, to the topic. Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, "I hate quotations. Tell me what you know." Well, I'm going to give you a lot of quotations in this speech I have for you because I think they're very relevant to a couple of the underlying issues of fake news, Trump, and the First Amendment. And the first question we have to ask, I believe, fake news, serious topic or a gussied up political cliche? There's a second question, which is this: is the clash between reporters and this particular White House, which feels at times visceral and almost existential, certainly to me, maybe to you, is this something new? And are these tactics new? And are the threats to journalism and the First Amendment brand new? Must journalists adopt new tactics to deal with the situation? That's kind of what I'm going to get at in my remarks today. So the first question: is the charge fake news a gussied up political cliche, or is it a legitimate charge against the foundational credibility and believability of journalism? Or is it just an inventive variation of a long-standing and all too familiar political tug-of-war over what can be best called persuasive truth? Now, as any politician will tell you who's honest, persuasive truths are ones that sound true, and in some cases may actually be true, but more importantly, they serve them because they persuade a select audience to move voters from one side of an argument to another, from pro to con or vice versa. So in this context of fake news and whether it's a cliche or not, let me quote Vice President Mike Pence on whether fake news is a real allegation against journalism or just a new talking point spicing up an old debate. March 2nd, Vice President Pence, I quote him now: "Talk about your fake news. Look at all the broken promises they made about Obamacare. They told us that the cost of health insurance would go down. Not true. They told us if you liked your doctor, you could keep him. Remember that one? Not true. They told us if you like your health plan, you could keep it. Not true. Again, I quote the vice president from appearance in February 23rd. Talk about your fake news, folks. Just look at all the promises liberals made about Obamacare. More recently, President Trump said he would not fire the special counsel, Robert Mueller, and he began to mend fences with his Attorney General Jeff Sessions, even though he has ritualistically, as you well know, dismissed the Russia investigation and everything around it as what? Fake news. A ruse, an excuse, a hoax. You guys are paying attention. I really appreciate that. All of this rhetoric, pure and simple. Political conversation meant to persuade and cancel out a competing interpretation of events, facts, or perceptions. So, is what I'm telling you fake news, nothing more than rhetoric, and myself as a journalist and all of my journalistic colleagues can ignore it? That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is this: the bedrock questions of journalism, as I've come to know them and practiced them for more than 30 years, are never irrelevant to my profession or the way I do my job on a daily basis. And I'm not going to rely, nor should you, on politicians to raise these bedrock questions. Journalists must raise them ourselves and hold ourselves accountable. What are these questions I'm talking about? Is the reporting accurate? Does it strive for the best daily version of the provable truth? Is it relentlessly curious about differing points of view? Does it provide context, history, and, in the process, increase understanding? Brian was very generous in his introduction to me, but I'm often, as I sit listening, I think to myself, my resume should really be sort of skipped or condensed as follows. Major Garrett is a somewhat well-known figure in an industry with declining market share and record low credibility. I mean that. Here's what I mean. According to a Gallup survey just last September, only 32% of respondents said they had a great deal or fair amount of trust in the media, down 21 percentage points from 1997, down 40 percentage points from 1976. Within political parties, 51% of Democrats said they trust the media, 30% of independents, and 14% of Republicans. In 1997, those numbers were 64% for Democrats, 53% for independents, and 41% for Republicans. In very stark terms, the credibility of my profession is collapsing, and my industry must relentlessly ask itself, why? It must ask the economically relevant question as well. Is this decline in credibility and market share correlated, or is it simply a coincidence? Related to this, does the combination of less credibility and smaller market share give the charge of fake news more traction than it deserves? Does it give politicians more latitude, more motivation to use fake news as a cudgel? I think it is fair to say, a unique perspective on this question of presidential power, journalism, and what a White House says about an approach to journalism it finds objectionable or worthy of public condemnation or retribution. As Brian mentioned, I once worked for Fox News. In 2009, I was a senior White House correspondent for Fox News covering the new Obama White House. Now, I'd covered the 2007 and 2008 Democratic campaign. I'd interviewed then Senator Obama 7 times for the Fox News channel, 3 more times than Jake Tapper did of ABC. Okay? So it wasn't as if I was canceled out of the Obama world because I worked for Fox, or deemed by then candidate Obama as someone so disreputable he wouldn't sit down with me. 7 times, okay? But at the time in 2009, right after the inauguration, I was a senior White House correspondent. And the Obama White House, at the very highest levels, branded my news organization an illegitimate front, an agency of pro-Republican propaganda. Here's a direct quote for you, just to remind you. We're going to treat them the way we would treat an opponent, Anita Dunn, then the White House communications director, told the New York Times. As they are undertaking a war against Barack Obama and the White House, we don't need to pretend that this is the way the legitimate or a legitimate news organization behaves. That message was endorsed and amplified in public by senior White House officials, from David Axelrod to Valerie Jarrett. My children can tell you this. It was the most stressful period of my life as a professional journalist. And when it was over, and when this metaphorical war was declared over by President Obama, when he granted me an interview along with every other traveling network correspondent in, of all places, Beijing, China, I was asked live on Fox what I thought of this war. I said, I was always a conscientious objector. And I meant it. I was not at war with the Obama White House, and I was most certainly not a warrior for Fox News. I was a journalist for the audience I served, a journalist protected by and invested with the responsibilities of the First Amendment. I tried to win absolutely nothing. I tried to report the first draft of history accurately, credibly, and aggressively. I knew no other way then. I know no other way now. Now, even though generalized attention to this subject of White House power turned against the press is much more topical today, I'm glad to say it draws a very big crowd. It was a little bit lonelier back then, in 2009. I had a lot of colleagues who'd sort of look at me and say, well, good luck, Major. Not even we're with you, just good luck. The stakes, though, are precisely the same, and I will remind you of a couple of other aspects possibly forgotten of the Obama presidency. The stakes were the same for James Rosen and James Risen, James Rosen of Fox, James Risen of the New York Times, both subjected to prolonged and harassing Obama Justice Department attempts to obtain their records and threaten them with federal prison sentences because of their acts of journalism that the Obama administration disagreed with. Now, this is all just to underscore a simple point and a simple fact of life for anyone who operates at the level of journalism that I operate at. If you're a journalist in Washington covering the presidency, people in power are likely to distrust you and dislike you. They are also likely to find ways to intimidate you, shake your hold on your job, shame you into timidity. This, we should never forget, comes with the territory at the top of the American pyramid of power. Now, a while ago, I promised you an answer about this question, whether this environment we're in, which feels so jarring and so very different, is, in fact, without precedent. There's no absolute answer to that because perceptions influence beliefs. If it feels different, if it feels hyper-pressurized, then at some very simple and basic and important emotional level, it is, because these emotions are real and cannot be ignored. But we can add some perspective to what I experience every day are somewhat raw and jagged emotions. Maybe you do too. So let me start this by reading about an American president. You might find this interesting. A quotation. He revolutionized the art of presidential communications. He had come to realize that he could control public sentiment best by bypassing the editors and going directly to their readers. Rather than making time-consuming public speeches, he transformed the so-called public letter into a weapon of mass communication. The president in question, Abraham Lincoln. The tool in question was public letters published in favored newspapers, a shorter version, one might tartly observe, of a tweet. The aim, however, precisely the same, bypassing journalistic gatekeepers who sturdily ask pesky questions about presidential words, actions, intentions, and results. Let's broaden the discussion a bit. Is the current environment brand new in terms of the means used to shock the press, influence public perception of reporters, or even the president? Again, let us acquaint ourselves with President Lincoln. I turned to a book written by Harold Holzer, interesting title, Lincoln and the Power of the Press, The War for Public Opinion. Gary Wills wrote a review of the book in the New York Times Review of Books about Holzer's list of the 5 ways Lincoln manipulated the press throughout his legitimately lionized political career. One tactic was called buying off. Allow me to quote from Gary Wills' piece in the New York Times Review of Books. Armed with the presidency, Lincoln famously tried to appoint cabinet members and military officers of as wide political variety as would cooperate with him. Holzer shows us something further, that he, Lincoln, used patronage to recruit the loyalties of newspaper owners, editors, and reporters on a grand scale. Newspapering became the preferred path to becoming an ambassador, port inspector, revenue collector, postmaster, and White House staffer. Dozens and dozens of the ink-stained were brought in to save the Union. Allow me to offer a few other examples. Herbert Hoover, as president, was so irate about gossipy leaks within the White House, he ordered White House security to track them down. And then, as President of the United States, issued the following order, and I quote, "Only such news as is given out through the stated channel of the executive office should be printed by the newspapers of the country." And even affable, accessible Franklin Delano Roosevelt once gave a White House reporter a dunce cap because he was, in FDR's opinion, irretrievably dim-witted. More seriously, FDR gave another reporter an Iron Cross for his allegedly pro-German coverage of the White House. And how can we forget Richard Nixon? Allow me to quote from the prologue of a book called Poisoning the Press by Mark Feldstein. And indulge me, this will be a non-dramatic reading of a pretty dramatic moment in American history. Quote, "More surprising still was the target of this assassination scheme. Syndicated columnist Jack Anderson, then the most famous investigative reporter in the United States, whose exposés had plagued Richard Nixon since he had first entered politics more than 2 decades earlier. Most astonishing of all, the men who plotted to execute the journalist were covert Nixon operatives dispatched after the president himself darkly informed aides that Anderson was a, quote, thorn in his side, and that, quote, we have got to do something with this son of a bitch. The conspirators included former agents of the FBI and CIA who had been trained in a variety of clandestine techniques, including assassinations, and would later go to prison for their notorious break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate building. According to their own sworn testimony, the men weighed various methods of assassinating Anderson by spiking one of his drinks or his aspirin bottle with a special poison that would go undetected in an autopsy, or by putting LSD, I'm really reading this straight from the book, or by putting LSD on his steering wheel so that he would absorb it through his skin while driving and die in a hallucination-crazed auto crash. The book gets better, if you can believe that. But let me at this moment pause to say one thing about journalism. And I find it grating, and I suspect audiences find it grating, and it's helpful in this context. The lazy crutch of 2 words that you hear a lot in my industry. I wish you never heard them at all, but you hear them way, way too frequently. Controversy and unprecedented. One of my first editors at the University of Missouri School of Journalism scorned the word controversy. Tell the reader what is happening and let the reader decide if it's controversial. If it is a topic of importance and people are disagreeing passionately about it, calling it controversial is redundant. I quite agree. Unprecedented is its own black hole of journalistic blather. As Harry Truman once said, the only thing new in this world is the history you do not know. Possibly relevant to our conversation today is another Truman observation about communication. If you cannot convince them, confuse them. I will leave you with 3 final observations about the power of the press and the power of the presidency, and how a free society can and must question the actions and words of a sitting president. The observations come in this order: from Teddy Roosevelt, President John F. Kennedy, and another by former Admiral William McRaven. In a letter to the editor of the Kansas City Star in 1918, Roosevelt said the following, and he was speaking as a former president who was taking the unusual public posture of criticizing a sitting president, Woodrow Wilson, over his strategy during World War I, and I quote, "To announce that there must be no criticism of the president, or that we are to stand by the president, right or wrong, is not only unpatriotic and servile, but is morally treasonable to the American public. Nothing but the truth should be spoken about him or anyone else, but it is even more important to tell the truth, pleasant or unpleasant, about him, meaning the president, than anyone else. In 1961, President Kennedy delivered a speech to the American Newspaper Publishers Association in New York. He first talked about the perils of the Cold War, describing the Soviet Empire and its advantages when it comes to this question of power and the press. And I quote, speaking of the Soviet Union, "Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. It," meaning the Soviet Union, "conducts this Cold War, in short, with a wartime discipline no democracy would ever hope or wish to match." Kennedy went on, "I have no intention of establishing a new office of war information to govern the flow of news. I'm not suggesting any new forms of censorship or new types of security classifications. I have no easy answer to the dilemma that I have posed, and would not seek to impose it if I had one. Perhaps there will be no recommendations. Perhaps there is no answer to the dilemma faced by a free and open society in a cold and secret war. The question of national security, presidential power, the Cold War, later the hot war in Vietnam, coursed through the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations, and journalists fought doggedly for the truth and sought to puncture glossy government depictions of wartime progress, and sought equally aggressively to evaluate secret missions and covert actions taken on behalf of a free people. Kennedy was seeking some form of prior restraint on questions of national security, but he tried to balance that pitch with this declaration. I quote again, "Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive. And that is why our press was protected by the First Amendment, the only business in America specifically protected by the Constitution, not primarily to amuse and entertain, not to emphasize the trivial and sentimental, not to simply to give the people what it wants, but to inform, to arouse, to reflect, to state our dangers and our opportunities, to indicate our crises and our choices, to lead, mold, educate, and sometimes even anger public opinion." It's a great speech. I highly recommend it. You can find it on the web. Finally, former Admiral McRaven. He spoke about the press in February of this year. He's been the chancellor of the University of Texas system since 2015. Before that, for 37 years, he served the United States Navy, rising to become the 9th commander of the Special Operations Command. McRaven said in this speech in February that he had traveled to 90 countries in his military career and considered American journalists the best in the world. Allow me to quote from McRaven's speech. "There is nothing more important to a democracy than an active and engaged press. Is it perfect? Far from it. Does the media make mistakes? Far too often. But flaws and all, I believe the free press is our country's most important institution. If we are to challenge the sentiment that the news media is the enemy of the people, and challenge it we must, then journalists must do their part. We need journalists with the courage to speak truth to power, but it has to be the truth, not just their truth. Truth means getting the facts right every time. It means having multiple, solid sources to confirm those facts. It means eliminating bias and hubris from reporting. Good journalists hold themselves accountable. When they make a mistake, as we all do, they own up to it and then work twice as hard to avoid making more. But what makes journalism so essential to our democracy is that, when done right, it holds all of us accountable to our country, to its ideals, and to each other. These are standards no self-respecting journalist can or should ignore, in my opinion. Making people in power uncomfortable with the facts has been a good part of my life's work. And as I hope I've illustrated, if ever so briefly today, there is nothing fake about the difficulty of doing that work or the inherent risks involved with it. And there is absolutely nothing new about politicians trying to divert, distract, diminish, or demonize journalists who engage in these vital, contentious, and important labors. What is new right now is after years of Americans wondering if journalism matter and if facts and accountability are permanent or near permanent methods by which free people can judge those elected to govern them, we have a renewed fascination and curiosity about what journalism is, what it does, and what are the ethical and professional obligations upon this thing we call journalism stands. The audience online, on radio, through podcasts, TV news, long-form writing, documentaries, hasn't been this curious, hasn't been this large, hasn't been this attentive in years. What will the government do now? What are the checks and balances? What are the institutional levels of power? How will this elegant system of co-equal branches of government the founders bequeathed to us function amid the unpredictability of a Trump presidency? The stakes, you might say to yourselves, feel high and real and vivid. It's because they are. Time magazine asked earlier this year if truth is dead. Well, Time magazine asked if God was dead in 1966. God was no deader then than he or she is now. Neither is truth. Did truth die when John Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Act? Did it die during the 19th century when politicians, large and small, bought newspapers, reporters, and editorials like so many trinkets? Did it die during Teapot Dome scandal or when robber barons turned the government into a clearinghouse for greed and corruption? Did it die during the Cold War, during Vietnam, Watergate, Iran-Contra, Bill Clinton's impeachment, or Saddam's weapons of mass destruction? Truth did not die because the search for it, that is truth, did not perish. Truth may have been delayed, but it was not denied. The question is not whether truth is dead, but will the search for it ever die? I say on behalf of journalism and the First Amendment, never. Not ever. And that's what makes this work, the work I do, the work of my life, all the more meaningful and important. And I hope, in some quarters, possibly even cherished. Thanks for listening. Okay, I promised questions and answers, so up with your arms, let's go.
Along the lines of the fake news idea, earlier on, a few years prior, we had the notion of truthiness.
Introduced by Stephen Colbert.
Yes. I was wondering if you could comment on your perception of the difference between what truthiness and fake news seeks to address in the popular mind.
Well, truthiness, as explained by Stephen Colbert, is that which isn't true, but we wish were true and we believe it true to make ourselves feel better. Okay? Fake news is, fake news has two distinct definitions, and they're very important. The one I talked about was this political cudgel to say, I don't like this story makes me uncomfortable, this story gets at some other truth, maybe halfway, and I don't want you to get any farther, so I'm going to debase it and try to debunk it and try to diffuse it by calling it fake. That's one aspect of fake news. The other aspect of fake news is actual fake news, generated intentionally, rebotted by all sorts of other conspirators to create a meme factory of things that have no basis in reality whatsoever, just to churn up one type or another of partisan aggravation in our country. And if there's one thing I hope we can all take away from the reality that a nation like Russia deeply embedded itself in our social media culture in the 2016 campaign, quite separate from whatever is revealed or not revealed or legally prosecutable with the Trump campaign or anyone else, separate from that, we should take a step back and tell ourselves this important truth. Our partisanship was used by our enemies against us. That should, I would hope, take our foot off the partisan accelerator a little bit, because our adversaries have seen it as a way to do us harm, to use that to weaponize our own sense of division. That's never been tried before. And I'm pretty confident in surmising that the reason it's never been tried before is there wasn't this atmosphere that existed in which it could be so easily exploited. And that partisanship that we sort of think is, well, it's just part of the process. Well, no, it's not. Not if it can be weaponized by people who wish us ill, just to turn ourselves against each other with the other kind of fake news that is a part of this conversation, which is the illegitimate news that's just thrown out there, rebotted and shoved through algorithms to land in people's Facebook feed and Twitter feeds. And then the middle of the other thing is truthiness, which is just stuff you tell yourself to make yourself feel better. You know, that may have some aspect of truth, no truth, or be a lot more true than not, but the most important aspect of it is it makes you feel good. And I'm glad you asked that question because it leads me to this one thing I always say in the context of remarks like this. At the end of the day, before you go to sleep, if everything you've read, everything you've watched, everything you've listened to makes you feel great and reinforced, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. Stop doing it that way. Do it the other way. And the other way is easy, where you're not so comfortable, where you're a little off game and you're a little off balance because you've read something, you've heard something, you've found your way to something that at least at some small level adds or subtracts to this worldview that you're so harmoniously confident of. Get yourself off balance. That's a much better way to consume that which the very large and multifaceted journalism industry creates. So, yeah.
So I think this election has really proven how like alternate media like Facebook and Twitter has like a really big impact on our electoral process. And something that kind of came up is the impact of like comedians like Stephen Colbert, John Oliver, SNL. So I guess I wanted your like comments on how a lot of people seem to be going to those sources to try and like get their news.
All right, so I referred in my opening remarks to my three magnificent children. When I was working during previous campaigns, and they were much younger, they would rarely, if ever, watch my news broadcast, but they would learn a lot more from Jon Stewart and make it clear to me upon coming home from long road trips, 5, 6, 7 weeks, that most of their news came from Jon Stewart, not me. You know, which was okay. That was just a reality. That was their reality. And you mentioned Jon Stewart. I highly recommend. Go online. You can find it. It's a 2015 interview he did with Chris Wallace, Fox News, where Jon Stewart says several things. One of which I completely agree with, because I've said this throughout my journalism career. The big problem with journalism is not the L letter meaning liberal. It's the L word meaning lazy, okay? The problem with journalism is laziness, complacency, lack of curiosity, and, as Jon Stewart says in this interview, it's penchant for phony controversy, sensationalism, and shallowness. That's his indictment. That's his bill of particulars against mainstream journalism. And it's a foundational accusation. It has real merit, and our industry has got to come to grips with the idea that those three things, while they can create a certain audience, that audience keeps shrinking, and our credibility shrinks along with it, and we have to re-examine a lot of those things. And Jon Stewart's point in that is, and John Oliver has taken this to another level, Samantha Bee does this as well, you have comedians who have entire research staffs of journalists who do a tremendous amount of research on underlying issues. You watch a John Oliver piece that goes on for 16 minutes, you have like a small bachelor's degree in whatever that topic is. And you've had a chance to laugh a few times. So they've taken this idea of satire, but also added to it foundational structures of journalism and brought it to another level. And in this interview, Jon Stewart says to Chris Wallace, what I do is so much harder than what you do. I research the news, I go several layers deeper than you do, and then I put it through the creative process of comedy. I take it 3 different layers. You just sit in anchor chair and read the teleprompter. All valid criticisms. And what he's driving at is one of the things that gives John Oliver, gave Jon Stewart, gives, when he was there, Stephen Colbert, others, and Samantha Bee, who does it on her show now, the means by which to talk about issues through a comedic prism, but talk deeply about them. They're not shallow about these issues at all. And to me, it's no wonder. If you can get informed and laugh at the same time, why wouldn't you choose that? Why wouldn't you go in that direction? And when I worked, for example, many, many years ago at U.S. News and World Report, we had an entire staff of fact checkers, an entire library of people, 16 people. And if I had a magazine piece, I had to substantiate with a piece of paper or my interview transcripts every single word in that piece. Every single word. And or if I couldn't, it wouldn't be published, pure and simple. Well, not only have magazines gone away, but large journalism organizations that had boiler room operations like that, fact checkers, that's all gone away. Copy editors have gone away. Newsrooms have shrunk not only in personnel, but in ambition. And yet comedians have become much more intensely journalistic. You know, Johnny Carson wasn't doing investigative journalism jokes back on The Tonight Show, but John Oliver, then Jon Stewart, Samantha Bee, and others do those now. They almost see it as a mission to fill the comedic needs of the country, the satirical needs of the country, and some of the journalistic needs of the country. And they're taking that on. And I say, God bless it. I got no problem with that. Yeah.
I used to watch a program in Sweden every night called Reportage, and that was it. It was simple. It was half an hour long, and you had the facts, you had a very basic commentary, and you had the imagery. Didn't patronise you, didn't seek to be a form of entertainment, and it's quite dull actually when you look at it.
Quite dull, actually, yes.
But
Yes.
At the end of it, it allowed you to make your mind up what you thought.
Right.
And it struck me that it was properly journalistic because it seems to be something that's no longer practiced, is old-fashioned reportage. It seems to be that journalists sit around as pundits, trying
Yes,
to be,
way too many of them.
trying to be funny when they're not comedians, and trying to be sort of entertaining.
Right.
And do you think that's the problem with journalism today? It's allied itself closely too much to the
It's certainly one of the problems of television journalism, absolutely, and cable television for sure. Cable television has two models, ideological or entertainment. I worked for CNN in 2000, 18 years after the network was founded in 1982. When CNN first started, it didn't have any talking heads what to speak of at all. It had long pieces, 3-4 minute pieces, would go on forever. I was entranced by those pieces. I thought that's like every piece was a mini documentary, full of reporting. And as CNN matured and cable news either matured or atrophied, I think atrophied is probably a much better word, reporting kept shrinking and guests kept multiplying. So you'd have, well, let's have the obligatory 2 minutes from the reporter and 58 minutes of talking about reporting, as opposed to 58 minutes of reporting and 2 minutes talking about the reporting. I mean, and that sense of comparative weight, even within the news organizations themselves, was intentionally diminished. Because it's easier for people to talk about what they just heard than to hear more of what they've heard, because, as we say in the business, too much reporting makes your hair hurt. It's uncomfortable. So we'd rather have people have a phony argument about what they just heard for 10 minutes, as opposed to 10 minutes of reporting and maybe no phony argument, which I think is a much better way of approaching the journalism side of broadcast television. So the entertainment element and the entertainment compulsion of cable news is certainly part of this. And then you have the ideological MSNBC, Fox continuum. And thrown in the middle of that, you have this other phenomenon of the 2016 campaign where you had the existing ratings pressure, but now no television organization is simply a television organization. It's a digital organization. So it lives and dies by clicks as much as it lives and dies by ratings. And so clicks and ratings become this lockstep mechanism by which to gauge how you're doing. And in the early stages of the Trump campaign, nothing clicked or moved the needle more than Trump. Nothing. And there became an addiction, an audience addiction, and a ratings clickbait addiction to the Trump phenomenon, which early on everyone thought would be harmless and profitable. Well, it was profitable. Next question. Yes, ma'am.
Two things. One of them was I heard a quote from Mark Twain that said something, he was patriotic about his country, but he was skeptical about his government. And if you could comment
Sure.
on that. But also the term whataboutism. I think I read an article a while back, I don't remember the author of it, but Colbert may have come up with it or someone like that. Can you comment on that as well?
Whataboutism?
Whataboutism. Do you know about that?
No.
Have you heard about it? The article I read, it basically says that, you know, let's say you have a Fox News commenter, just as an example, and that commenter says, let's say you have a quote unquote a liberal commentator saying this is something about somebody, or a comment about a specific politician or person, and then the other side, say the conservative side, and switches sides, comes back and says, but what about this, but what about that, what about, so, you know, they say, well, Trump.
Shifting the frame of the argument.
Shifting the frame of the argument to somebody else outside the argument, but trying to parallel it and trying to distract the argument into another direction.
Yeah, that's a long-standing tactic of rhetoric. It takes on a kind of a saliency in the Trump world because so oftentimes that's all that's left is well, what about this other thing? I'm not really comfortable defending or dealing with the underlying specifics of this. So let me raise this other potential red flag or this red herring or something that's distracting or pulls the argument viscerally or emotionally in another direction. That's kind of a common tactic, and I think that has an exhausting element to it, and it lacks a sense of intellectual centrality, and I don't believe it's a growth stock, if you will, in terms of public discourse. I think it's of diminishing value and will diminish over time. The first question was about, to be patriotic is to be skeptical of the government. Sure, of course. I never served the United States military, but I consider myself and my journalism career as close as I can conceive of in a professional world to be an act of public service, to be there, to work the long hours, to ask people in power what they're doing and why, and to compare what they once said to what they say now and what they once did to what's going on now, and do the dollars add up, do the promises conform with, or the actions conform with the promises, et cetera, et cetera. Skepticism is built into the American ideal and the American relationship to the government. And this attempt at the presidential level to bludgeon it out is a serious topic. It's a serious issue. Fake news is part of that conversation. And as I tell my journalistic colleagues at the White House frequently, it's meant to make us emotional. It's meant to get us very angry and defensive. And I recommend, as persuasively as I can to my colleagues, not to get emotional, not to get baited by this attempt to make this feel what it, at a certain level, is existential, but to focus on the work, focus on the journalism, because I have a firm and unshakable belief that credible journalism will always outlast incredible politicians. Yeah.
You've been with a couple, reporting on a couple of different presidents. Do you think
5,
there's
yes.
a character arc of the presidents based on how they are first seen by the media and then presented by the media, and in general their job? Does it change? Do you notice a lot of changes over time of the presidency? And what would we expect with this president in that way?
All right, so my wife is here as well, Laura Brown. She's a PhD in political science and 100 times smarter than I'll ever be about some of these underlying foundational issues. And she has a great phrase about the presidency and character, which is this. The the presidency doesn't change your character, it reveals your character. That character which you've always had in the crucible of the presidency emerges in all of its strengths and weaknesses, all of its most inventive aspects, and all of its most destructive weaknesses. Okay? You don't become a different person, and your character doesn't achieve a new sense of strength or glossiness or potency or sense of confidence simply because you're in the Oval Office. If anything, the pressures and the rigors and the intensity and the 51-49 decisions that inevitably come with the Oval Office force your character to the fore, as it was when you walked in the very first day. Now, your hair may change color, the lines in your face may get deeper, but your essential character doesn't go anywhere. If anything, it becomes more revealed to the country. I believe that to be fundamentally true and consistent with every observation I've made about every American president I've covered. And I think you will understand in the current context why I make no predictions about what's going to happen with this presidency and tomorrow, let alone six months from now. Trump supporters would say if they were standing here, don't worry about the character. Country evaluated the character. Country elected him. That's it. Live with it. Okay. That at one level is a truism. But that doesn't answer the character question. The character question is an evolving question with this president. And all I can tell you is I'll be there to watch. Yes, sir.
I was just curious, given your experience in the field, how would you advise teachers or faculty members to advise students about how best to engage with journalistic outputs or media so that we can kind of grow a body of people who become better kind of processors of the data and the information?
As participating journalists or as consumers of? It's a good question. It's a harder question to answer than it used to be because newspapering is a much smaller part of our American experience now than it was even 15 years ago. The idea of actually holding and reading a newspaper fully is kind of antiquated. It's become almost a quaint relic of a different era in America. And I can tell you, when I spent 19 years in the newspaper business before I got in the world of television, I can remember vividly those days when the paper would land on your desk, and there'd be 5 sections of a newspaper, man. And you'd look at it as a complete product. You'd look at that, you'd say, wow, look at the front page. Look at those headlines. They're good. They're sharp. Good stories. Great art. Look at good caption. Let's open up the local news. 3 good stories. Look at the sports section. Great lead photos. Some excellent headlines. Oh, in the feature section, we got some really great stuff about the community. Man, we told our community's story all right here. It's 5 beautiful sections. It's to behold. It was one of the great thrills of my life as a newspaper man. I loved it. I mean, the whole idea that this vast newsroom that I worked in, 100 different people and press room operators and copy editors and line editors and photographers, all threw in every single day and produced those 5 sections. It was remarkable. It was like to me, it was like a minor miracle that we were that ambitious and that productive on a daily basis. It was intoxicating. And I have great affinity for journalists lucky enough to work in newsrooms now where that's still true. Journalists who work for the Washington Post, which has been revived under Jeff Bezos, who work for the New York Times, which, because of the massive online increase in circulation, their newsroom is re-energized. The LA Times is beginning to be a little bit more re-energized. But look, the last 10 or 15 years, American newspapers have done nothing but shrink. nothing but shrink, 30, 40, 50, 60% reductions in staff. Their ambitions are completely hollowed out. They're husks of their former selves. And therefore, understanding what's going on in a community is a much less productive enterprise. So 15 years ago, I said, well, have them start reading the local newspaper. Well, I can't do that now because if they were to do that, they would find a lot of wire copy, one or two flimsy stories about the local stuff, but not much about the school board, not much about the water district, not much about the mayor or the county council or anything else. Where are you going to find that? Well, that's one of the great questions for America, journalism, and communities. How do communities understand themselves if there are not the journalists there to tell them what that community story is? And I'll tell you what's happened with the absence of ambitious, energetic, 5-section community newspapers. Every local issue becomes a mindless proxy for the national debate between red and blue. And let me tell you this, the water district has nothing to do with the National Republican Party or the National Democratic Party, and never will, okay? But if there's nobody there to tell you that, then they all just become proxies for this partisan, red and blue jousting that goes on endlessly. And this is not, I can't give you a direct answer to that question except to do what I said earlier. At the end of the day, consume as much as you can and be disrupted intellectually as much as you can. But I will tell you about something that's promising. And part of the reason I'm going to tell you this is because a dear friend is putting this together, but I also believe it's an enormously important experiment. In Las Vegas, Nevada, the newspaper that I used to work for, the Review-Journal, was recently acquired by Sheldon Adelson, one of the largest casino owners on the Strip. And as a result, the journalism from that newspaper reflects one opinion and one opinion only, that of this casino owner, okay? And this paper is a shell of its former self. It's just not a reputable, credible source of community journalism. John Ralston, the best political reporter in Nevada, a dear friend of mine since 1986 when we first met, has created a nonprofit newspaper called the Nevada Independent. It's entirely online. It has no office. The office is everyone's laptop. It has a business manager, 2 photographers, and 6 reporters, and 1 editor, John. And they write stories about the school board, the water district, the county council, and the city hall in Las Vegas, because the Review-Journal can't do that. And they're supported by people who live in the community of Las Vegas. Now, are some of those supporters rival casino owners of Sheldon Adelson? Yes, they are. But it's a nonprofit. It takes no advertising whatsoever. And I was just out there, and I front-lined a fundraiser where we raised $50,000 on a Sunday afternoon for people who just live in Las Vegas, who put their credit cards on the line on behalf of community journalism. Now, that's an experiment to me that's not only near and dear to my heart because it's my beloved friend John Ralston, but it's near and dear to my heart because this has got to be part of the future. Communities have got to understand that this is not just a notional resource, it's a vital resource for what your community does and how it understands itself. And the means by which we support that and find ways, either in a nonprofit foundation or foundations like the Ford Foundation or other people that give money to all sorts of other enterprises, maybe they give money to newspapers and leave their hands. I don't know what the solution is, but I do know as newspapers shrink in their ambition and scope, so does the community's understanding of itself. That's not a really direct answer to your question, but it is a hobby horse of mine, so I took the initiative on that one. Yes?
You spoke earlier about how you think cable news is either entertainment-based or ideologically based.
That's a big part of the business model, for sure. There's plenty of journalism on there, but a lot of it is those 2 foundational impulses.
Do you think that there's anything intrinsic about that format that causes that? Do you think there's
Intrinsic?
Do you think there's any hope that the format could go back to more what you were talking about, like at CNN in 2000, or if there's any way that there's someday there will be an MSNBC and
Right. Look, I mean, I say this a lot after the election. Anything's possible. in all aspects of American life. Literally anything is possible. And by that I mean what audiences do, and what audiences want, and what audiences learn, and what audiences choose to consume, I think always dictates new and innovative products, whether it's in fashion or journalism or handbags or ties or whatever, music. And we're in an interesting space now. I mentioned in my prepared remarks about this curiosity, renewed curiosity about institutions, their strength, their vitality. What do the federal courts mean? What does Congress mean? What are the three co-equal branches of government? How do they intersect? I would say, in a general sense, for the last 20 or 30 years, we've kind of had a hipster attitude about the vitality and importance of institutions. Oh yeah, they're sort of there, but whatever. You know, we can get along without them. They're not all that important. And who's in them? What difference does it make? We had this kind of nonchalance about that. Well, if there's any silver lining about this current turbulent political time, it's that. We've reevaluated the importance of core institutions in this country, what they mean, who's in them, how they operate, and how transparent they are, and what they mean to us in our daily lives. So that's a shift. Well, if that shifts, then you become more interested in and more curious about the means by which you learn about those institutions and how they function, which could be a very downstream benefit for this industry of journalism. And we may learn in our own way the value or lack of value of swimming in a news environment entirely defined by our social media feeds. We may have different patterns about that 4 years from now. We may say, you know what, if it's there, I'm going to be like alarmed by it as opposed to induced to believe it. Because our default psychological reaction now is if it's in my social media feed, I'm going to be more likely to believe it than disbelieve it. Well, 4 years from now, we could turn that upside down. We could say, wait a minute, I don't know what's coming at me anymore. So I'm going to evaluate that differently, and I'm going to choose different patterns of weighing and judging the credibility of information, and that may change entire bandwidths of consumer habits. And if those consumer habits change, I hope our industry will be there to be responsive to them. I think that's certainly possible. I think there are many levels of hangover effect of the 2016 election. How we absorb and obtain information from our social media feeds, I think, is evolving. And it may be in a completely different place 3 or 4 years from now than it is now. And if it is, and there is a greater priority placed on that which has gone through the filtration of independent journalism, has more market viability, and therefore a price attached to it, a value attached to it, I hope we'll be there to meet those needs. Yes, sir.
2 quick questions.
Sure.
One, have you ever sent your kids out to touch the steering wheel just in case? and number 2, could you talk a little bit about the investigative side of being an investigative reporter and what kinds of sources you're able to develop in the Trump White House in particular? Or is the contempt for the press just so deep that it's tough to do, or is it normal?
Well, the investigative side is within the Trump White House. There is a contempt, and there is a diminished institutional value placed on obtaining facts and distributing them on behalf of whatever the policy is. There's a sort of sense, well, it's the policy, and you figure it out, and we're not going to explain it. We don't need to explain it. You get in the way anyway. You're intrusive. You ask pesky questions we don't know the answers to. And so we're institutionally not even going to prepare ourselves for that process, unlike any other White House I've ever covered, that would go through elaborate pre-preparation processes to be ready for any rollout of any policy. So that's one. 2, that disdain and that hostility is subsumed to political rivalry. So rivals will talk all they want. I mean, I get calls all the time because rivals are trying to stab somebody else in the back. And if they think I'm a useful conduit of that process, they'll talk to me. Sometimes I'm not even investigating anything, and they'll talk to me. They'll just come out of the woodwork. So what is unusual and at times comforting, and it's sometimes distracting, because at times these rivalries are so petty and so ridiculous, I have stopped caring about them because they don't really amount to anything. They're not changing policy, and no one's being fired. They're just trying to get someone fired, and that process can go on for months and months and months, and people will call you up and say, that guy's going to get fired. You should write a story. And I'm like, look, this isn't my first White House. I'm not going to write a story that someone's going to get fired when all I have to do is make 2 phone calls and find out that person's not going to get fired, and all you want me to do is write a story that that person's going to get fired so you can create a meme that this person might get fired, so you might have slightly more advantage the next time you're in the same meeting together. And there are a lot of very young reporters who fall for that scheme. And because it's a competitive environment, I spend a lot of more time than I would like, actually, talking my network off the ledge on stories like that. I can't tell you how many times I was asked to write a story about Reince Priebus getting fired, because people started calling me about that the second week of February. I mean, literally the second week of February. He's going to get fired. He's going to get fired. He's going to get fired. Well, eventually those stories were all right, because he did. But I knew it wasn't going to happen soon, and I knew it was a process, and I knew he was tenaciously fighting for his own job, and I would be pressured to write that story or report that story, and I'm like, I'm not doing it. It's just not going to happen. I'll talk generally about the pressure he's under and the factions that are aligned against him, but I'm not going to say he's going to get fired. Lots of people did. Go back. You can find stories. Reince Priebus is going to get fired February. Reince Priebus is going to be fired March. Reince Priebus is going to be fired May. And all they had to live on now is, well, I was eventually going to be, I was right, I was just way ahead. Well, way ahead and 100% wrong is not a standard I'm comfortable with. Just call me old-fashioned. Anybody else? Oh, yes. Sorry.
So you mentioned, in your remarks about that this is not a new phenomenon, fake news and being uncomfortable with stories and crying and whatnot, but a lot of them end in ways like Watergate, where you have kind of this collaboration of the law and the media that come together eventually. And I think, you talked about that dichotomous playing into sides and kind of this clickbait phenomenon that's happening. And I think a fear for a lot of people is this idea that this administration in particular is somehow not going to be held accountable by the law or journalism potentially, and I know if you.
Well, sure, people fear that. And the question was this anxiety that no matter how aggressive journalism is or how much of a bulwark the courts are, they're not going to, either institution, either by itself or in indirect collaboration, reporting on one another, functioning as the judiciary does, can hold the Trump administration accountable. That's a generalized anxiety. I acknowledge that. You see it reflected in polling data. You see it reflected in man-on-the-street interviews or any kind of focus groups. And what I would say to that is an anxiety. It's a legitimate anxiety. In democracies, when anxieties manifest themselves, they also manifest themselves in the next election. Ask Ralph Northam in Virginia whether they manifested themselves on his behalf against Ed Gillespie. Ralph Northam won in suburban districts in a way that no previous Democrat in the last 30 years had won in Northern Virginia. Concentration, because voters, even though at the time, in the last 8 days of that campaign in the Virginia governor's race, Democrats at the national level were bleeding each other on the public stage, savaging each other over Hillary Clinton's remorsed and dissected for the 7 millionth time lost to Donald Trump. They were savaging each other on the national stage, hugely distracting. In any other normal environment, that could have suppressed or depressed Democratic turnout. It had no effect at all. None. Virginia voters knew what they were going to do, and nothing in the national atmosphere was going to have any influence on that at all. On the turnout modeling, also turnout modeling wrong. Why? Because, and this is something I had to come to grips with continuously in the 2016 campaign, we had reached a level in political journalism, and certainly in the polling and the modeling mathematical side of politics, of thinking that the machinery had really become understood. The mechanisms, the demographics, the impulses, the subtle contours of political reaction had been so thoroughly filtered and examined and cross-examined and laid over each other repetitively over a series of presidential and midterm elections that we thought we had the science pretty well figured out. And so all the methodology told us what the result was going to be. And we had a certain self-satisfied contentment about that, all of which was left in smoldering ruins about 4 a.m. November 9th. And the modeling in the Virginia gubernatorial race was wrong also, because it was going off of all those subtle contours in a completely different atmosphere. And the atmosphere now, for better or for worse, is fundamentally different. All of our atmospherics of all of our elections have no modern, meaning the last 12 or 16 years, comparison. I think every election going forward for the remainder of the Trump presidency, however long it lasts, is infused by the Trump effect. And so every bit of modeling we did that exists before the Trump reality has to be weighed differently, has to be weighed hesitantly and cautiously. Because in Virginia, it was especially, well, in Washington, D.C., I'll just tell you, that weekend before that election, which Democrats had really hoped they would win, but there was tremendous anxiety and teeth gnashing that Ralph Northam, the Democrat, was going to lose, and that they had blown this opportunity. And the knives that had just been removed from the still decaying corpses of all the people who worked on Hillary's campaigns were being sharpened for all the people who were working on Ralph Northam's campaign, okay? Because the level of anxiety and sense of depression among Democrats in D.C. who were paying close attention to that race were so inflamed. He won by 9.5 points. It was a complete blowout. It was never competitive. That race was called by 9:30 or something. Why? Because voters didn't care about all this other static. One of the reasons they may not have cared about that static is this underlying anxiety of wanting to send a message, of wanting to slam the brakes on, of wanting to have their political voice act as air brakes on the mechanism of politics. That's how elections work. That's one of the great governing processes in our country. We have elections, and elections send signals. And let me tell you, on December 12th in Alabama, if Doug Jones, by some event, wins, you want to talk about an air brake? I mean, that air brake will be heard. It will be, ears will be bleeding. It will be heard so loud in both parties, and reactions to it will be pronounced. Okay, so one of the means by which anxiety is collectively expressed is through the ballot box, and your generalized anxiety about whether journalism can succeed or the federal courts can succeed, hey, there's another mechanism. It's right in your hands in any given election. And one of the things that I have always believed and have seen reinforced in every election I've covered, and I've been lucky enough to cover every presidential campaign at one level or another since 1992, is that this process is real. And the vote does matter. And what you do or don't do, whether you get off your butt or not, does matter. And those who do change the conversation. And if there is a collective anxiety, and I hear you say it, and I've heard it in other contexts, and that anxiety manifests itself, others will feel it and respond to it as well. How are we doing on time?
One more question?
Yes, sir.
Any thoughts on Charlie Rose?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. He had to be fired. Pure and simple. Had to be fired. And I wish he hadn't done those things he did. I wish he wasn't a creep. Wish he wouldn't have assumed that his journalism career and the success of it gave him license to mistreat people. This job carries with it a tremendous amount of responsibilities. It can also bring you a fleeting degree of celebrity. It can, in certain contexts, give you a certain amount of power. But if you got into this business, as I did, to check power, to scrutinize power, you don't abuse power.